Alright, hello, Jeff Scott again. We've been talking HTML5 and CSS3 courtesy of Muroc's HTML5 and CSS3 3rd edition. We're up to Chapter 13 talking about working with fonts and printing. Another fairly short chapter. So we want to be able to use the CSS3 at font face selector, Google Web Fonts, Adobe Typekit fonts, etc. to embed fonts in a web page. Now, every computer comes with its own set of fonts. Alright? But Google Fonts is probably the best example where you can go out there and you can find hundreds of free fonts that you can download and then make available to anybody who comes in and uses your site. Use the Add Media Print selector to add styles for printing a page to the style sheet for displaying the page. Use the second style sheet that should be used for printing. So the difference between these is, if you have a cascading style sheet for printing only, you're probably not going to print images because it uses a lot of toner. If you do print images, you're not going to print them in color because it uses a lot of color toner. You probably don't want to print hyperlinks and the like, so you want to keep it down and just print the general, or just the stuff that you really need. In general terms, we want to be able to describe how the CSS3 Add Font Face selector works. In general terms, describe how Google Web Fonts and Adobe Typekit fonts are used, and in general terms, describe the way that you format a web page for printing. Describe 3 ways you can provide the styles for printing a web page. Describe the use of these properties for printing a page: display, page break before, page break after, orphans and widows. And explain why inches are often used as a unit of measure for printed pages. So, if you're following along, I'm up on page 457. And the first thing that we're going to talk about in here is how to import a font. To import a font, you copy the file for the font family into a folder on your website. In the CSS, you code a rule set for the at font face selector, such as the one that's shown here. So here the font family is Muroc, and that's the source, or that's where the font is. Then to apply the imported font, as you see in the example in the middle here, in the rule set, you use the name that you gave the font as a value for the font property. So CSS provides the Add Font Face selector that you can use to import a font family. In the example you see here, a file for a TrueType font, which is a TTF named Harrington, has been stored in the same folder as the web page. Now, I already mentioned the Google Fonts website. So it's google.com/fonts. And if you go to the Google Fonts webpage and browse through the fonts, you're going to see so many of them, the chances are good you're going to find one you like. You can filter the fonts to display by using the controls that are on the left-hand side here. So if you want ones that are thicker or whatever, maybe you want a cursive font or whatever. To select a single font, you click the Quick Use button. If you want multiple fonts, you click the Add to Collection button. Alright, then there's a 4-step procedure for using the fonts. You select the styles and the character sets you want to use, number 1. Number 2, you add the link element that imports the font to the head section of each web page that will use the font. Number 3, using the Google font name for the font family property as you want to for the font. Alright, there are some examples here. So the Google Web Fonts are a free Google service that allows you to select and use any of their fonts. There are currently about 670 of them. When you use Google Web Fonts, you should list one or more other font families just in case the browser doesn't support that particular font. Now again, not only are there the Google fonts, there's the Adobe Web Fonts website. So you go to the Adobe Edge Fonts web page and click Getting Started. You can browse through the fonts till you find one you like, then hover over it and choose the Select This Font link. All right. Then there's 3 steps you've got to follow. First, you visually verify you selected the right font. Second, you copy the script element that's provided so you can paste it into any web page that'll use the font. And third, you copy the font family that's provided so you can use it to apply the fonts to HTML elements. They've got an example on the bottom of page 461 I should say. You see there the link element that you would use for importing an Adobe Edge Web Font. And you can see the CSS that applies. So Adobe Edge Web Fonts, they're a free Adobe service. They have more than 500 fonts, and you saw that earlier when they showed the picture. They're powered by Adobe's commercial Typekit engine, so the fonts are delivered to the web pages quickly with a minimum of downtime to load that. All right. So, the skills for formatting printed web pages. To format the printing of a web page, you need to know how to define the styles for printing, and you need to know how to use CSS properties for printing. All right, so first thing that's shown here are link elements for separate screen and print styles. So in other words, you're going to have a print CSS, but the big one is here, media equals print, that says that's a printer only CSS. Then your media query, you can have a media query for print only. Again, you might want a very simple font like Times New Roman. Remember, the default media type for the link element is screen, so you have to specify media equal print. When you provide separate style sheets for screen and print, you usually code the link element for the print one second. That way the print sheet just needs to override the screen rules that need to be changed. Again, you see an example, or you saw an example, that's called a media query. It's normally coded after all of these CSS rule sets. You can also embed a style element within the head section that provides this. The recommendations as far as what you do, most of this stuff is what I had said to you before, but I just want to say it one more time. All right. First, as mentioned here, change the text color to black and the background color to white. Should just make sense. Change text other than headings to a serif font to make it easier to read when it's printed. Use a base font that's easy to read when printed. Just because it looks nice on the screen doesn't mean it'll look nice on the printed page. You may want to print out just a page first to look at it, make sure you're using indeed the right type of font. Keep the line length to 65 characters or fewer. Remove site navigation. You can't use it on a printed page anyway. Remove as many images as you possibly can. All right, by default, most browsers don't print background colors, images, and gradients. Users can change that option if necessary. All right. Some of the CS properties for printing shown here in the chart on the middle of page 465. You've got display, which determines how an element is displayed. Block, inline, none. Page break before, which determines when a page break is allowed before an element's box. Page break after, which determines when a page break is allowed after an element's box. Page break inside, which determines when a page break is allowed within the box. Orphans, which is the minimum number of lines within an element that can be printed at the bottom of a page when a page break occurs. And widows, which determines the number of lines within the element that can be printed on the next page. If you don't want an element to be included when a page is printed, you can set its display property to none. All right, just a couple. Again, most of this stuff is pretty, hopefully at least, is pretty obvious. Here's 2-column print. This is the same page that was printed back in Chapter 6, plus the navigation bar and the figure caption. The main structural elements are the header, the nav bar, the aside, the article, and the footer. In the CSS for the article, the CSS3 column count property was used, so the first column contains 2 text columns. IE9 doesn't support a column count property, so you won't see 2 columns of text in there. And then finally, the printed page. Notice in the example here, again, the navigation menu inside are not printed. The heading, text, and borders are set to black. The article looks a little wider. The font has been changed to a serif font so it's easier to print. You should always do a print preview on this first to take a look at it. All right, to make sure that you want it, looks the way you want it to look. And then finally, here's an example of a style sheet for a printed page on page 471. All of the rules in the print style sheet override the settings in the style sheet for the screen. The width of the body and article are set to auto, so they will be as wide as the printed page permits. The font family is set to a serif font. The font family for the headings is a sans serif font, and the color of the H2 and H3 elements are set to black. The display properties for the navigation and sidebar are set to none, so they aren't included. The borders for the header and footer are set to black. And to set margins and paddings, you can use in inches. Inches is the unit of measure, which makes sense because you're going to be printing it on an 8.5 by 11 page anyway. So with CSS3, you can easily embed fonts within pages. We now have talked a little bit about some of the third parties like Google Web Fonts and Adobe Edge Web Fonts to embed fonts into pages. Either way, you can be sure the fonts will be available to all browsers. When it comes to printing, you already learned you can use a print style or media query to format a page, and you learned, again, some of the things that probably just make common sense for you to be using. We'll come back in just a couple minutes. With Chapter 14, and FYI, Chapter 14 is how to use CSS3 transitions, transforms, animations, and filters. I will be back with that shortly.